And we're live. This is a special Discord only event. So welcome Discord Super Friends. Tommy B here. No Superflex dude. Not alone though. Brought on my good friend Jake. How you doing today, man?
I'm doing well, Tommy. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So you and I, we've had a chance to talk, I don't know, two or three times now. And every time we do, my respect for you grows. My ears open up because I think we think alike. I think that our strategy talk always sort of like goes down these really interesting paths. That said, John was asking me like, "Hey, do you want to start to get into player takes, to get into player names and put names to the strategy?" And it startled me a little bit. And talking with you off air, I think it's something that maybe we as strategists sort of ignore or cast to the side in the non-point scoring season. And that's probably a mistake, right? Like, talk to me how you layer in player takes into your strategy analysis.
Yeah, that's a really great start. And so thank you, John. I appreciate you not being here, but presenting us with this daunting task as strategists. You know, for me, it really does come down to working through what other player takes are happening throughout the entire landscape of the community. So using those player takes and almost counteracting them in a way where individuals see value is kind of where I want to take advantage of. So to speak through a couple of windows, and we'll actually be talking about this specific player, but he's being talked about so much, is someone like Josh Downs, right? Like Josh Downs is one of those individuals that right now across the entire blue sky verse, X verse, wherever you are on the internet, is just being hyped up to an extreme amount. And this is the type of thing that I personally want to try and get off of. So if I can take advantage of those types of circumstances and see where individuals are, propelling or pushing individual profiles in a particular way, regardless of how I feel about the individual player, that's kind of the best part about it. I will move players like that. So I don't necessarily come up with player takes myself. I promise that the ones that I do provide today will be my own, but I don't typically go through this process.
What's interesting to me when talking about player takes is you don't have to have a take on every single asset, do you, Jake? Like, you can just sort of omit assets from your buys, sells, holds, whatever label you want to put on them, because we can't roster everybody. Of course, if you're in like 1,000 leagues, let's say, you probably are rostering everybody at least once. But I don't think a lot of people play that way. Most dynasty managers, in my experience, the ones that I talk to, they only have like 1 to 5 leagues at most. And then there's the sickos who have 20 plus, 40, 50. I don't talk to a lot of folks with more than 100 leagues. And so if you're capping out at that 100 leagues, there are still probably assets that you don't roster. And I think that's okay. But when you only have one league, like, you have to be really intentional about the players that you're rostering, the players that you're acquiring, selling. And so it matters a little bit more. The players that you have to have a take on. And so we asked the super friends, hey, y'all, like, what players are you struggling with right now? What players are you working through? And we got probably 30 or 40 players mentioned. We're not going to get into 30 or 40. I wish we could. And maybe one day we will. Maybe we'll just do like a 5-hour stream, you and me, Jake. That's not today.
I'm ready. I'm ready.
But we did pull a few from that list. And I think if y'all hold on all the way through the end, we're actually going to do a player that we don't have on our show sheet, a player to be determined. I don't know who it's going to be yet. And we're going to walk through the process in real time of how we evaluate that player and how we build a take on that individual asset. But what do you say, man? Let's get into one of the players we have on our show sheet. How's that sound?
Sounds good to me.
Cool. Mr. Bucky Irving, somebody who last non-point scoring season I was really in on. I was getting him in thirds and fourths, maybe spending more than half of my fab. He was one of those players that was available on waiver wires if you only had like a 3-round rookie draft, let's say. And so I was spending, 55, 60% of my fab on Bucky Irving. And damn, did he pay off. It was kind of a slow burn, 4th-round pick, kind of an undersized back, I think 195 pounds, in a really ambiguous and somewhat difficult situation to overcome. Rachaad White was essentially leading that Tampa backfield last year, especially from a pass catching sense. But come midseason, Bucky went nuts. He started to get a little bit more rush share, is how he started to take over that backfield. And he really turned into, I hesitate to use the term league winner, but he was incredibly impactful from the running back position. However, going into this non-point scoring season, I think there is a lot of ambiguity around what Bucky Irving is, what he isn't, what he might become. So I've got some analytics-based numbers, metrics that we can put behind Bucky, but I'm going to pause right here. Do you have any contextual takes before we dig into those numbers to sort of set the table of what Bucky Irving might be this non-point scoring season?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's a really great way to kind of present what Bucky is. And I think kind of going off of how I prefaced my own process of player takes, I was at a close to 80% exposure of Bucky coming out of rookie drafts. I actually drafted him in almost every single rookie draft that I could and found him somewhere in, to Tommy's point, the early fourth, sometimes late third. I almost never let him actually get out of a draft. Even around the 411, 412, I'd trade in just to make sure that I didn't have to go to waivers and potentially get outbid. So he just happened to be someone that I was really into. And funny enough, I also got off of him, I think, in 100% of the leagues. So he is the type of player, in more often than not, because of the fact that he's going against a lot of the analytics that I look into, specifically in regards to hit rate. I just don't necessarily want to go in hard on assets like that for the long term. So when I see potential off ramps, he's the type of guy that I would want to get off on. And so I unfortunately don't have a lot of Bucky. And I think my take here is probably going to be a slightly more conservative, but in the sense of understanding that there are no major structural changes to the team. We know that Liam Cohen has left, yes, but it was internal hire within Tampa. So we know that realistically, it's just going to be a lot of bottom-up approach, very similar to when Dave Canales left to Carolina. And we didn't see huge structural changes to how the offense actually was supplementing Baker Mayfield. So for me, I don't necessarily see a huge usage change for Bucky and Rachaad White. I think one of the big things that we did see as the year continued to go on, though, was more route participation from Bucky Irving compared to earlier in the season, which I think is one of those big things that when we look at like end of year numbers, they do tell a really telling story to kind of Rachaad White being that quote unquote receiving back, quote unquote third down back. And I do think that that will still very much be his relationship. But I want to really call to action that so much of that still had a lot to do with Rashard's role at the beginning of the year, right? Like where he was truly dominating the passing downs. And that started to dwindle as the year went on. His usage in general, he was off the field significantly more. We saw a little bit more of Sean Tucker too, which was very interesting. The last thing I did want to shout out, because I happen to watch a lot more tape more than diving into the analytics, is that I was looking through some of the next gen stats. And one of the things that really caught my eye is that Bucky is actually sixth in rush yards over expected, which isn't really the most telling statistic or metric, but I do like that it does give into a little bit more about what you see actually on tape. Bucky is a missed tackles forced, elusive, creative runner. He will create yards. When you look at his actual rushing down usage, he runs basically all over the field. He'll run up the middle, run up the sides. He's most productive on the sides, trying to break outside those tackles. And I think we'll end up seeing probably pretty similar usage. But if I had to guess, you'll actually see a slight increase in his passing down usage based off of that total use by end of season. So I think where we're looking at, I think Tommy has this down. And I don't want to go into your stats, but it was pretty close in terms of route participation as well as yards per route run. But I do think that we'll probably see Bucky probably growing in terms of route participation from a down to down perspective, so that defenses will have a harder time understanding exactly why he's on the field.
Yeah, let's not bury the lead. Like let's get into some of those numbers because I think that they do matter. First and foremost, Bucky was a 4th round rookie pick in the NFL. You alluded to this. There's not a lot of stickiness to that profile. When those players do hit, the runway is fairly short. We think it's going to be longer than maybe it typically is. That said, Bucky is a very good football player, and so he could be an outlier. Last year, Bucky Irving had a 33% route participation, a very excellent 1.82 yards per route run. Like that is top 5 at the running back position type number. That's an efficiency stat, right? What he was doing, he was really good at in the passing game. And he was the first read target around 7% of the time. Rachaad White, his running mate, was a 44% route participation guy, 1.4 yards per route run in the first read in the offense, 9.3% of the time. I have a little hesitation about these efficiency numbers, these receiving numbers. Typically around 4.5%, running backs are the first read in an offense. They're the first look in terms of the passing game. And typically you're seeing negative ADOTs, right? These are behind the line of scrimmage type throws. We've gone through 2 offensive coordinators in the last 2 years. And typically what we see from year 1 to year 2 with fourth round running backs is actually a decline by 22%. A third of these players, these fourth round running backs, do gain work, but on average, fourth round running backs lose about 22% of their rush share. And so I have some concern about the fact that that is primarily what Bucky Irving was relying on was his increased rush share. There's been narratives coming out of Tampa Bay that Sean Tucker is going to see more work on the ground. Let's go to yards per route run. Typically, from year 1 to year 2, fourth round running backs lose 7% of their yards per route run. So that very excellent number is likely to go down if you're to look at historical comps. Even the successful fourth round running backs lose some percentage of yards per route run. It almost exclusively goes down. I didn't see a single case in the last 5 years where a fourth round running back actually increased their yards per route run without a dramatic increase in snap share. And that's not what I'm anticipating. We also see a target rate decline of 8.9%. And almost half of fourth round running backs who hit once never hit again. And that's a top 24 finish. That's not even top 12. So 47% of the time, fourth round running backs who have done this before just sort of disappear into the ether. And if you look at ADP, look at KTC, right behind Bucky Irving is TreVeyon Henderson and Breece Hall, 2 pass catching running backs. And so this becomes a risk tolerance thing to me. Are you willing to bet that Bucky is a true outlier? And if you are going to make that bet, are you going to bet that the runway extends beyond his historical comps, the ones who do well? I'm a little nervous about this. I in terms of like making a player take, buying Bucky Irving or rostering Bucky Irving, it seems like there's a lot of potential outs. The market seems to like him, and the outs just below him in valuation and startup ADP are better profiles. Second round running backs with better pass catching profiles, with clearer paths to production, with clearer paths to value gains. And so if we're going to make a player take, mine would be to get out from Bucky Irving. As much as we liked him last year, this feels like a very classic arbitrage opportunity, a very classic sell high opportunity. Where are you landing with this analysis, Jake?
Yeah, I'm with you in terms of going back to what I was saying before. This is an acquisition cost conversation as well for me, right? And so this is the type of situation where I'm never going to buy in at Bucky at most realistically going to be his peak or ceiling value. And this isn't because I don't believe in the talent. This isn't because I don't think that he can overcome Sean Tucker and Rachaad White. This isn't because I don't think that he might still outperform year 1. I do think that all of the analytical perspective that you put behind this to show that there should be a year 2 regression, I say even if he overcomes that, I don't want to make the bet. And that's because it's just going against the odds for me. And that's just not where I want to be. So yeah, I'm very much I'm relatively on the side of wanting to sell or push off into however many assets I can. I think this was a Superflex Super Show trade poll question where it was like Bucky or 2 firsts over 2026 and 2027. Let me go with the liquidity in those 2 picks easily over Bucky Irving. And that's just where my head's at.
Yeah, I think you could probably buy Jonathan Taylor for a single first at this time of the year and pocket that future first, right? Like you don't have to give up the production just because you're moving out on Bucky. I want to ask you though, Jake, like What if we're wrong? What is the ceiling outcome for Bucky? What could we be losing out on? And what are the consequences to us for selling at this price?
It's funny that you say that because I don't really ever think of things in that regard. And maybe that's an issue for me, but I don't believe that when you sell at a ceiling to what I believe is a ceiling, to ever really have true ramifications. Like in the grand scheme of things, I don't think that a fourth round running back like Bucky with his actual profile will ever probably oversee two first and maybe a second. So like what am I really losing out on in the grand scheme of things is kind of the way that I see it. Can I potentially get into other players at maybe a different time or window? Yes, absolutely. And maybe that's the reality. So let's say Bijan starts off the year with a small ankle injury and there's an owner who wants to get off of a profile like that because he's out for 4 to 6 weeks. That would probably be a great quote unquote like sideways move, sideways in the sense of you'll see, places like KTC where value drops drastically off of a player who has a early season injury. That would be a great time to get off of Bucky into something, that has a much higher ceiling that you wouldn't be able to do at any other time. But I think you could still do that with those two first. And that's just kind of the way that I see it. I don't have to take the gamble on the fact that Bucky starts off the year slow or that Rashard White has a more dominant role than he did last year with a new offensive coordinator. That's kind of where I sit.
Part of the problem with the Bucky profile is we were right. And being right sort of anchors the bias of like the valuation of Bucky Irving, right? So 1 out of 12 people, 8% of managers were right about this guy. You got him at this steeply discounted price. You waited or you traded for him right before the breakout, and it happened. And he created like successful outcomes for you down the back half of the season. That is a really difficult thing to bake into valuations, isn't it? Especially at running back, because it's such a variable position. Like you said, somebody's out 4 to 6 weeks. The value creators, whether or not it should, like we live in an unregulated market, and that unregulated market isn't just the downfall, the risk. It's the fact that like, yeah, we anchor our valuations at this ceiling outcome once it happens because we were right on them. And I think there's something that needs to be discussed around that.
Definitely. I think where we end up going through this process in almost the wrong way is understanding, quote unquote, what is a loss or what is a win. And so much of this process has to be malleable. Like there's going to be micro movements that happen where you're going to quote unquote lose, and you need to accept that. And whether or not that's going to be damning to your team's future is really down to you. But like, I don't think that getting off of Bucky, for instance, for two firsts right now, or Jonathan Taylor in a first, will ever be bad process. Like even if Jonathan Taylor were to go down next week in off-season weird injury, like it's just not bad process. Like there is logical thought behind it that makes sense to how it's going to better your team over the long term. And as long as we're okay moving away from quote unquote the end result of individual moves and going through why that move actually happened, that's really what matters to me.
Yeah. And this is a lesson that we sort of need to plant in the back of our minds because there are a lot of Bucky Irving types in this rookie draft, right? There were, I don't know, like 8 running backs drafted in the 4th round of this NFL draft, something like that. Bajal Tutin. There have already been comps to Bucky Irving, right? Like, I hope that it turns out that way. That would be freaking awesome. Like, it was an outlier outcome. We should not minimize that, but we should be preparing for what happens when we are successful. If you drafted literally every single one of the running backs that was drafted in the NFL draft in the 4th round, one of these guys is going to have an outlier outcome. It's going to look something in the vein of Bucky Irving. And so we can take those lessons that we've learned over the past 12 months with his profile and apply it moving forward, can't we?
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So here's an important one. Where's Tommy's hair? I've been cycling more and I can't have it like blowing around behind my helmet. It was annoying me, so I got rid of it. So it's not a great story, but that's where my hair went.
The better question is, where's Tommy's tux?
That's true. The tux is sidelined for today for the solstice. Happy solstice, by the way, Jake.
Happy solstice.
Yeah, it's a big day in my hometown. We have a big celebration in Alaska. Let's move on though, because we're 18 minutes in and we still got some more players to get through. You mentioned Josh Downs. Why do you think people are conflicted with Josh Downs? I think there's a lot of reasons potentially, but why do you think that folks are struggling with where to value Josh Downs, what our expectations might be, and where he fits in the dynasty landscape?
Sure. I think when we think of Josh Downs, we automatically have to look at the quarterback situation in Indianapolis, right? Like, I think too often we want to think long term. I think a lot of us like the profile and the actual tape on Josh Downs. And so we see that with a true competent quarterback and very like detailed play calling for Josh Downs, there's going to be success there. I think we can all kind of get on board with that. The work that Reception Perception does, Matt Harmon pushing out a lot of love for Josh Downs is definitely backed by, I think, very effective and efficient uh, tape review, and one in which I also agree from what I've seen from Josh Downs. That being said, Daniel Jones and Anthony Richardson do look like two quarterbacks who realistically will throw for under 4,000 yards no matter who starts. I think when you think of Daniel Jones, you're probably hovering in that 3,500-yard range. And you look at Anthony Richardson, you're probably hovering in the 3,200-yard range. So when you start to think about what that impact does on the entire wide receiver group, plus the add of Tyler Warren, who a lot of people have very high expectations on, which that's not the purpose of this conversation, you then think of how does that totality of yardage now kind of spread itself out into the wide receiver group. And I just don't foresee a world where we feel confident in any particular way where Josh Downs necessarily hits above a certain level of yardage that will make us feel more comfortable with a player like that, unless you're acquiring them, I think, at a relatively reasonable cost. And so Josh Downs is one of those players where I think you can probably break into two assets, get probably similar range. And I know you happen to love someone like this, but a Rashad Bateman, you get Rashad Bateman plus, and you probably get a very similar end of year total scoring perspective off of Bateman versus Josh Downs, even though I still think from my own perspective, I would rather Josh Downs the player, but that's not what I'm playing at.
Yeah. Let's talk about Josh Downs, the player. So over the last 2 years, he ran 439 and 351 routes. So 68 and 73% route participation. That's low, in my opinion, for a fantasy relevant player, a player that we're excited to start. I really like to see 80% or more route participation, especially in a low volume offense. Looking at Downs yards per route run, they are elite or near elite. 1.76 his first year, 2.29 his second year. Like, this is an awesome signal that we have a good football player potentially in a bad situation. His efficiency is really good. Not only that, but his first year, he was a 17.5% first read in the offense. Second year, 30%. So almost a third of the time, Anthony Richardson, whoever was playing quarterback, was looking for Josh Downs. That's something that indicates to me that they want to get him the ball. Whether or not the offense is effective or not, like, that's a different conversation. The offense is being designed in part to run through Josh Downs. You look at his first downs per route run, 0.068, 0.114. Again, excellent. These are like wide receiver one, high-end wide receiver two metrics. If you're looking at his efficiency, his ability to do something once he gets the ball. I was thinking, man, like, they're not the same player, very obviously. But if you're talking about strictly fantasy, the profile of Amari Cooper, put draft capital aside, you look at their efficiency, you look at what they do when they have the ball in their hands. It looks very similar if you look at the career arc of Amari Cooper and you compare it to Josh Downs. In terms of expectations, how do you feel that hits for you? Is that what you could see Josh Downs being with average or sometimes above average quarterback play in his career? Because he's going into the third year of a 4-year contract, right? Like, this is not a forever situation. Should we be buying talent over situation at this point, knowing that, like, all we need is a few things to go right, and we've hit something that sort of pulls beyond his current ADP?
Yeah, I think there's some context that's still missing here. And I do think that a lot of his increase in usage, specifically the first read percentage, had a lot to do with the fact that Michael Pittman Jr. was, for lack of better words, a dummy, right? Like they
Yeah.
used Michael Pittman Jr. last year as a protective dummy for that offense so that there was a true quote unquote X receiver out wide to remove the cornerback, typically cornerback one, off of the slot. Because slot percentage for Josh Downs, relatively high in comparison to the majority of the NFL. We will see, I think, that continue to go in that direction. I don't foresee his slot usage really changing all that much given what they've done in the offseason. That being said, I do see someone like Tyler Warren actually probably lining up in the slot a little bit more. And how that will impact Josh Downs, I don't particularly know. So there is definitely a line of thought here that makes sense, and I agree with you, where we can see something like Amari Cooper out of Josh Downs. The only difference, though, is that I think Amari Cooper's, for lack of better words, efficiency with regards to his total number of receptions to the actual amount of yards that he outputs has a lot to do with the more vertical route running that he does as well throughout his entire career that you just will not probably see out of Josh Downs. So you're going to get probably a more, I guess, pull back to the mean reality, I think, from Josh Downs this upcoming season as more of the pass catchers are healthier. And an ideal situation will have probably more usage out of guys like Adonai Mitchell as well. I'm not saying that because I think that Adonai Mitchell is particularly great. I just think that we saw windows throughout year one where it seems like the coaching staff was really buying into him. I think overall he still is relatively not polished. And then we also have players like Tyler Warren that I just don't know how to understand his impact yet, because I think that there's a lot of flaws in that particular profile, but yet the draft capital says otherwise. And I think that they'll probably dive right into it.
Yeah. How do you feel about sort of thinking of Josh Downs as almost like Christian Kirk as well? Somebody who, because Downs is successful on the outside. He's not asked to play on the outside very frequently, but you look at his success rate, his separation scores, they're not bad. He's a small guy, but that really hasn't been a factor in the NFL, in this iteration of the NFL over the past 3 years. And so he could be put in a situation like Christian Kirk was a couple years ago. He could be in a Ladd McConkey type role, a Jackson Smith and Jigba, Cooper Kupp type role. Like there's a lot of opportunity in the NFL, like beyond the limited scope of the Indianapolis Colts as they sit today, where I think that there is something that is maybe unseen in Josh Downs. I don't know. I am more bullish than bearish on Downs. That said, I've been able to trade him pretty high. And so I think, of course, it comes down to market considerations. But I think if you're a rebuilder, if you're somebody looking, sort of to 2027, this isn't a bad profile to buy right now.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think he is someone, though, that is reaching that level of consideration of wanting to sell simply because what you can get into similar price points will probably either oversee the shortcomings of what is kind of presented there in Indianapolis this year, plus me not having to guess about usage. And so that's kind of where I sit with Josh Downs. He isn't someone that I necessarily am trying to sell, but if the price is right, for lack of better words, I think I'm going to get out.
Yeah, we're going to do 2 trades. Real quick, Tony says, so crazy Pittman played with a broken back. Like, no kidding. These people are warriors on a level that we just can't comprehend. I'll stub my toe and be like, oh, I can't run for 3 weeks because my toe is bruised. All right, 2 trades. We're going to do mine first. I traded Josh Downs a couple weeks ago in a Trade Addicts league. So you got to start one of every position, and then there's a bunch of flexes after. I think start 10 or 11, something like that. I traded Josh Downs, and I got back Tyrone Tracy and Jaylen Warren, 2 running backs. I wanted production. I wanted a minimalist wide receiver build. That's the kind of thing you're talking about, right? Like get the production now. That way you're not guessing on the production in the future.
Exactly. Yeah, I think this is the perfect move to move through. And for a fact that if for whatever reason you wanted to get off of both those assets immediately, I think you could liquidate them at basically the same cost as Josh Downs at ceiling right now. So there's nothing wrong with that type of maneuver, even though quote unquote it might be a loss to the like general market. And when I say that, I think the market looks at that and probably thinks of Downs as greater than Tracy as a singular asset and Warren as a singular asset. And then when you push them together, a lot of the mentality I think that always gets pushed is, who's the best asset in the trade? And they would still say Josh Downs. Therefore,
Yeah.
Josh Downs would be the way to go.
we got a good one. Would you say you tiered Downs? That's great. Thanks, Jordan. let's help Tony out though. He's got a trade that he's considering as well. He has David Montgomery looking to trade into Downs in a small plus. What would that plus have to be for you to move out of Montgomery and into Downs? I'm thinking of another running back, like a Trevor Etienne, a Woody Marks, like one of those NFL 4th round running backs that we were talking about that has that ceiling potential.
Yeah, I agree. I think I was going to say somewhere in probably the 3rd round rookie running back range is probably where I'm at. And I think those guys that you just stated are probably there, touching probably the end of the 3rd round, start of the 4th. So yeah, I think that sounds about right.
Cool. All right. Hope that helped, buddy. Let's move on to Rome Odunze, kind of a confusing player, right? Like if you look at the underlying metrics, you look at the way that the Chicago Bears played football, it's like, what the hell is going on here? There's a lot of like confusion, at least from my perspective. Why do you think folks are struggling to value Rome Odunze specifically? What is it about either his profile or the way that he played, or maybe the environment around him was able to support or not support him as a rookie pass catcher?
Yeah, I think it's truly the latter. I think the environment as a whole was just a terrible realization of what a bad organization does to a highly talented roster. And so this isn't necessarily a player take on anyone in that particular offense, but I do think that when you think of what happens to Matt Eberflus and the way that that team kind of disintegrated, for lack of better words,
Yeah.
and then the small growth we saw out of Thomas Brown throughout the rest of the season, I think that end of season reality was what we could consider the most efficient process for the Chicago Bears as a team that was playing inefficiently, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
a team that could have done significantly more in a better circumstance probably would look like a wide receiver, specifically for Odunze, at somewhere around like the 65 to 70 receptions out of his 105 or 107 or whatever he had. And I don't think from a tape perspective, most of the incompletions from his generated targets were really on him. There's a small share, but when you look at just pure route running perspective, I don't think anything has changed from his very high grade from the community going into his rookie draft, where a lot of people were drafting him ahead of quarterbacks in super flex drafts, right? Like we're talking about somewhere in the 105 to 107 range. Nothing really has changed there for me from a tape perspective. And so I'm not overwhelmingly concerned about him on his own merit. It has a lot to just do with the work of Ben Johnson as well as the work of Dennis Allen. And I don't think a lot of people think about Dennis Allen when they think about the Chicago Bears. But what happens with the defense last year was relatively productive considering that Matt Eberflus, that is his background. The team did relatively well once he was gone from a defensive perspective. But I do think that we don't think about what happened in New Orleans from a player management perspective from Dennis Allen. That would probably be my biggest concern about the Chicago Bears this year is how bad is the defense? And we already know from a Cincinnati Bengals perspective, bad defenses typically mean higher producing offenses from a fantasy perspective. So we might find ourselves in an artificially inflated season this upcoming year, even though I do think that Dennis Allen, the defensive coordinator, is actually a very talented play caller. I just don't know how well he's going to be able to get players to buy back into him after a lot of the stories that have come out of New Orleans from the past 12 months.
Yeah. Do you play any team sports, or have you played any team sports consistently?
Yeah, I played soccer for close to 20 years. Then, unfortunately, due to concussions, I got 3 in about 2 months. Had to retire at the age of 22. Yeah.
I think this is a perfect parallel then. Odunze is kind of like a striker, right? Like you have to cultivate a successful environment for a striker to succeed, right? Like you need 7 passes for the one shot, right? Like, and that's being generous. Let's go through the numbers. I'm not going to belabor the point because I think it's gonna become very apparent here in a second. So Odunze ran 536 routes. That's 78% route participation. That's the sort of the threshold we're looking for, right? Like close to 80% in a high volume offense. He had a 55% catch rate, Jake. He had a 61% catchable target rate. So like of the passes that were thrown to him, 61% of them were deemed catchable via fantasy points. That's the 11th worst in the NFL for any pass catcher. Not over last year, over the last 4 years. Like half the passes that were coming his way, he had no shot at, right? So he's running all these routes. This is why I was asking if you play any sports, because like if you're a striker on a team where like you got a bunch of bozos that are like shanking balls, that are, chipping them well over the goalpost, that like they're not helping you out. What do? You press, you get frustrated, you round off your routes. Like Odunze was in such infertile grounds that like I don't know how you succeed when the second the ball is thrown your way, you've done everything to get that target, to deserve that target, and half the time it's going to sail over your head or fall in the dirt or in the defender's hands. That has to be so damn frustrating to be on the NFL stage and to have that happen to you, you know?
We saw DJ Moore walk off the field
Yes.
on 2 occasions last year, right? Like he is a veteran wide receiver. You wouldn't expect that to happen from them, but I think the reality is that things were so bad last year from an efficiency metric in terms of I'm a wide receiver, I'm running routes, I am open, I am causing separation. I am actually getting the ball thrown to me, but I have literally no way, no like humanly way to catch that ball. And I
Yeah.
think that does end up playing its own merit to like where the team was at by the end of the year. And it is a trickle down effect. I do think. Like, I don't think this is necessarily a strongly just Caleb take. Like, I don't know if this is just Caleb can't hit targets. That's not really where I want to take that necessarily.
Yep.
But I do think that for Rome Odunze to have a productive year 2, Caleb has to get better.
Mm-hmm. So if we just move the catchable target rate to like league average over the last 4 years, Odunze was the wide receiver 46 last year. If you just adjust upward his catchable target rate to league average and assume that like he would do as well with those targets, he would have been wide receiver 26 last year. And if Odunze finished as the wide receiver 26 last year, the narrative would be that he is what, a top 16 guy, maybe higher, somewhere around like a top 12, borderline top 12 wide receiver, maybe considered around where Ladd McConkey is right now. That is really impactful because we're just not seeing that. We're seeing it in like dynasty trade valuations. We're not seeing that in redraft projections. We're not seeing that in sentiment of getting Odunze into our lineups. We're hearing somewhere around wide receiver 36 with all the JJ Zacharyasons, the Matt Harmons, like all of those people, Justin Boone, like Pat Fitzmaurice, they're putting him as a low end wide receiver 3 in this year's rankings. If we just can get some semblance of a competent passing offense running through Caleb Williams, we could see incredible upside. So like, what are you doing with this information? Are you inclined to buy in? Because he's not cheap right now. Odunze is an expensive asset. The signal is kind of there, in my opinion, though. Do you agree?
Yeah, I do agree. It's funny because so much of the narrative does have a lot to do with someone like a Luther Burden, who I think there's a lot of divisiveness around. And I think even trying to comp what Luther Burden can do to someone like Keenan Allen in last year's offense, who, I think he had somewhere around 125-ish targets by the end of the year. Like, if Burden can even get close to that, Burden has to start practicing first, right?
Yes.
Like he's a rookie receiver with a soft muscle issue, a tissue issue that like, if he's not practicing, I don't expect him to have as much of an impact early season. But with that being said, I do very much want to be buying into Rome Odunze. I think that he is the type of profile though, that given unique managers in unique situations, there are probably ways to get in under market. So what I mean by that is really fish. Tommy and I were talking about fishing before. Tommy hasn't been able to go physically fishing as uh, successfully as he's wanted to in the past. I think this is a great time to go fish amongst your league mates and see who is or who is out of the Chicago offense. If people think that, Colston Loveland or DJ Moore or even Luther Burden are going to be the target hawks of this offense, Rome Odunze is a perfectly great example of trying to get into someone at a relatively meaningful cost and get out of potentially other dwindling assets. Like, this is a prime example of how I want to try and use someone like Josh Downs that we were just talking about before, and use a lot of the hype about how his actual market valuation is increasing to a place where I want to take that and then try and tier up, in my opinion, into someone like Rome Odunze, who I think has a more meaningful path to a higher end of season output.
Yeah. So Jordan in the chat is saying he doesn't think the argument is that Odunze isn't good. It's that Odunze isn't cheap. You can't buy low at the ADP. There's a bunch of other like good bets around there. I bought Rome Odunze last week in an experts league called the 12 Olympians. And this is a team that I took on. It was an abandoned team. And I consolidated through the non-point scoring season. And I got a few extra firsts. And I've started spending that extra capital. And I traded a different manager, a contending manager's 2026 first, and I picked up Rome Odunze. I think those deals are out there. Is that in every single league that you can get Rome Odunze for a single future first? Maybe not, but I don't think that that is an extreme outlier in terms of acquisition costs. There are managers who are entrenched because they see the high draft capital. They see the same things that we've talked about that Jordan is referring to in the chat, that this is probably a good player. And they're holding with the intent that the environment will shift. But if you can get Odunze for a single first, especially if it's not yours, I think that's a really good move for a team that maybe is like a fringe team or a building team, a team that you're not entirely sure if you want to make the playoffs or not. Like that's the type of asset that I kind of want to bring on and layer onto that team to pair with some other up and coming pass catchers, because I don't think it's such a risky bet as maybe one of these first round wide receivers that we're getting in our 2025 rookie drafts.
I completely agree with that. And if you can use someone like a Tet and get a plus on Rome, like that would be the way to go, in my opinion. And that isn't because I'm off of Tet either. Like this is the funniest part about this for me, is like, I really don't have player takes, right? Like it really is just about where values are. And I really am just trying to get additional value on top of players that I think have some type of pathway to success. And like, when I think of Rome, I have only acquired him twice in 2 startups this offseason. I acquired them both in the late 5th, I think somewhere in like the 508, 509 range. And like when I think about other players in that general range, I'm just trying to think of whether or not that's actually Rome's market. And it looks like it is. Yeah, it looks like on Dynasty Data Lab, he's sitting somewhere in the mid 5th. And that's me going with Rome over someone like a James Cook, a Josh Jacobs, and understanding what that means. And, we talk a little bit about this also on Dynasty Underdog, thinking about outlier running back relationships where a James Cook scoring 14 plus touchdowns last year, and Josh Jacobs now having his second 300 plus carry season in his career, which we already saw a regression after the last one. Like those are types of bets that I'm trying to get off of so I can get into players like Rome, regardless of what I think, that single season reality will look like for Josh Jacobs or James Cook. So that's kind of, I think, like some of the differentiation that I might have with the market. But yeah, that's kind of where I sit.
Somebody brought up a really interesting point in the Discord, that a lot of these players that we're talking about today sit in that startup ADP somewhere in the 5th and 6th round, right? And if you want to avoid these difficult decisions, these difficult questions, trade up or trade back, out of the 5th and 6th round. You don't have to pick these players in startups if you don't want to. The ambiguity can beget all sorts of like positive outcomes. And I think that talking through and figuring out player takes is kind of important, especially in that range, because the acquisition cost is still pretty high, right? Like we're paying something of value for these players. Let's move on to another one of those types of guys, though. Ladd McConkey, another player that I think we were both in on going into lineup season last year. Mike Cash put me on to Ladd McConkey. He was doing the whole dads for lads thing last year. And I was in, he was an exquisite route runner. Like he was so good in college at getting open. And it's like, oh, you're going to pair him with Justin Herbert. This is great. This is going to be like pretty awesome for 201 type rookie draft costs. And what did Ladd do? Well, he ran 81% of the routes, 450. Kind of a volume issue, but that offense in general was just a low volume offense. He was on the field enough. 2.57 yards per route run, which is unbelievable as a rookie, like Odell Beckham type unbelievable as a rookie. He was the first read in that offense 29% of the time. Again, just like elite numbers, and a 0.116 first down per route run. Like every underlying metric for Ladd McConkey is elite or near elite. You would think that he'd be like some analytics king, right? But I'm seeing his ADP, his dynasty valuation, kind of propped up in a range that makes it so I can't choose him as a value, right? Like again, being right, I think has sort of elevated him to a point where I can't get in on this profile that is so juicy and enticing, and somebody that we probably in past years would have been like, why aren't you guys buying into Ladd McConkey? I think people are today. Do you agree?
I've definitely seen it. I've seen individuals trade out of the 101 into Ladd Plus. I've seen pretty extensive, what I would consider potential overpays for profiles like that. But in the grand scheme of things, I do think you're going to get a pretty consistent output player for Ladd. Like I think Ladd is, for lack of better words, the like non-quintessential wide receiver in the NFL. Maybe he's the New England Patriots quintessential wide receiver one. So you end up finding yourself probably playing into unfortunately like archetype narratives rather than actual output narratives, right? So what you're talking about is literal success versus expectation. But we do, I think, find ourselves where, since there isn't anyone else in the offense yet, potentially Trey Harris, potentially Oronde Gadsden, you never know, potentially Tyler Conklin, but like when you look at the offense as a whole, when Quentin Johnston is coming out as the second target earner out of that offense, I don't think that there's a lot of fear from the general public when you're thinking about market valuations of a player like Ladd McConkey, which is why he does get propelled into an area where I find it borderline impossible to acquire. And I think that's kind of where I have a difficult time, just like you're saying, to acquire him at startups, to acquire him currently in the offseason. There isn't a way in unless I am really, truly willing to take on some value loss. And for the most part, Ladd isn't going into any of my roster builds to a place that I feel like is going to take me anywhere that I need to be going.
Yeah. I kind of am reminded of Amon-Ra St. Brown with Ladd McConkey. Not so much with like the phased integration into the offense, but just how they play football. I think that they're very similar in their approach to route running, the ways that they get open, the hits that they open themselves up to, like good and bad qualities of Amon-Ra St. Brown. Do you see the comparison there? And if so, what are we potentially missing out on by seemingly being out on Ladd at cost right now? Like, are we going to look back 9 months from now and say like, gosh, we missed the next Amon-Ra St. Brown and we saw it coming?
Yeah, it's funny you say that because I just saw very much like a meme post on the internet about how both Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson will both be over the age of 26 in this exact time next year, right? And the dynasty community is unable to fathom having a top 3 ranked wide receiver at that age. So I do think that there is a possibility where Ladd reproduces year 1 with maybe even slight uptick to a place where he is hovering around that wide receiver 5-6 range versus what we look at now. He's touching, I think, wide receiver 8, 9, 11. So I think that's kind of where my mind sits, is a small increase, but I don't know if the necessary output aligns with those other top 5 wide receivers. And I think that's kind of where I sit. So from like an analytical perspective, I know that this wide receiver is going to be successful, but I don't know if whether or not in that specific offense that means the same output as the other receivers in that general area. And I think of even someone like a Nico Collins. Like, I think Nico will still probably find ways to get you closer to 2 to 3 points per game more on average than Lad will, and will be cheaper in probably the next 12 months because of his age. So I'd rather probably, quote unquote, tear down in the next 6 months when Nico's considered old again, from Lad, knowing that the output is probably going to be the same, but also be able to get, once again, that plus on top of him.
It feels pretty safe from a value perspective, the floor of a Ladd McConkey over the next 6 months. Like, I don't think we need to be concerned about getting out. It's just the getting in part seems to be the big challenge.
Definitely.
Let's do 2 trades real quick regarding Ladd McConkey. Marvin a first for Ladd. Any thoughts there?
That seems steep, specifically around just like market valuation of Marv. I think from production perspective, I think it makes a lot of sense. Honestly, I think I'd much rather be in on Ladd than in on Marv. It really depends on kind of like where roster construction is as well. But that to me is one of those where the league probably freaks out about and says, "Oh, that seems expensive," but I'd probably be okay with that. What about you?
Marvin Harrison Jr. represents a lot of flexibility. This feels like the first of 2 moves, doesn't it? Where you've got Ladd McConkey, you trade him for Marvin Harrison and a first. The league freaks out, say, "Oh, you can have you can have Marvin Harrison Jr., other league mates, come and get him." And then you get Devontae Smith and a 2-1 swap. And all of a sudden you've turned Ladd McConkey into essentially the same profile in Devontae Smith. And you've pocketed 2 firsts at the cost of a second, right? Like, that's the type of move that I think is pretty easy to accomplish with a Marvin Harrison Jr. And you're leaving that meat on the table for that Ladd manager to do their thing, right? And so if you're willing to have a certain disloyalty to those types of assets, you create a lot of outs for yourself, in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, the next one's going to be mine. Same league, 12 Olympians again. I traded away Ladd McConkey, Jared Goff, and the other first round pick, a 2027 first. Again, not mine. So Goff, McConkey, and a first. And I picked up Jalen Hurts. This is in a half PPR. There's a little bit of a premium to the quarterback position as well. That's the kind of move I like doing. You know, let's move on from somebody probably at a ceiling in terms of their production last year, and Jared Goff, who I traded a second to get into. And so sort of like packaging Ladd in a way that is going to create a more robust and probably productive profile at the quarterback position.
Yeah, I think that's easily into the Hurts side, and kind of surprised that you were able to move through the league like that. But I think that that's, to your point, how you take advantage of ceiling values of multiple assets. I do think that, like, going back to where Ladd could be is probably a differentiation of where Ladd probably will be in the next 12 months. And so you very well could have taken 2 assets, used them at their very peak value, and then gotten into what I think will continue to be a top 5 to top 6 points per game quarterback over the next multiple years. So yeah, that's fantastic process.
Oh, so Jordan said he did essentially what we were talking about. He then traded Marv. So he had Ladd, he got Marvin that first, and then he traded Marvin next, second, and a third for Mahomes, JT, and a first, right? Like, that's the way you navigate these types of moves, because the sentiment is very much on the Marv side still. And so you're leveraging both production and value in really interesting ways. Let's keep moving though. We've got 2 more. Kyler Murray is next up. I'm just going to stop here. Do you have any initial thoughts on Kyler Murray? I've spoken about him, I think, at length over the last few episodes. What do you think about Kyler Murray, the player?
Yeah, I think he's particularly lazy from a understanding of the game perspective. He has a lot of weaknesses from a physical identity aspect of how he has to manage games just because of his unfortunate reality of his height. And we've seen other players succeed at shorter heights. So I don't believe that it's the only detriment, nor should it be the quote unquote detriment to his play. I just don't think that Kyler understands the game well enough from a higher analytical perspective to best succeed in the NFL. With that being said, though, Kyler from a fantasy output is insanely consistent. Like, if you look at him as a profile, he is, if not probably one of the most consistent outputs for a quarterback. You're talking about a quarterback that will realistically throw for somewhere between 3,700 to 4,000 yards almost every single season that he's healthy. That's also a huge caveat. He will also run for somewhere between 500 to 700 yards on the ground. So if you want to get into a player that you know what the output will be like by end of season, considering that he will be healthy, I think he's usually going to be a buy more often than not, especially given where his value has kind of tanked from last year. Now, with that being said, he outputs the same season as he does this year. The Cardinals don't make the playoffs again. Kyler is going to be in a very precarious situation to own a starting job in the NFL, I think, moving forward. And that's not saying that he won't be able to get into one. I'm just saying he's going to find more struggle, I think, than what we would like to admit, just given his unfortunate lack of playoff success in the NFL, which is unfortunately what drives a lot of the NFL's decision making moving forward. So all of that to say, like, I'm fearful of Kyler Murray for the long-term success window of a quote unquote like dynasty value. But I think in the terms of 2025, I don't see any statistical drop off from him, but that doesn't mean that I also see any statistical output success or increase from someone like Marv.
Yeah. Jay joining the chat. What's up, Jay? He says Kyler is bad at football, but good at fantasy. Just don't watch. Jordan saying bye-bye, Kyler. I've looked at Kyler sort of and tried to figure out what the hell is going on. As a rookie, he was given a lot of easy buttons, wasn't he? Like the environment around Kyler Murray was incredible. The defense was good. The staff was fantastic. The coaching staff like knew how to use Kyler, and the NFL didn't really know how to defend that type of profile super successfully back in, what was that, like 2019 or whatever.
Yep.
And so like he was really, really good. And that created what I think are unrealistic expectations of what his career was going to be. And as Kyler has progressed throughout his career, we've seen the complexity of the offense grow, and the necessity to get to not just your first read, but your second and third read as well, which I think is exactly the wrong way to use Kyler Murray. I think that almost like a Tua or Trevor Lawrence type perspective, where 3/4 of the time it's first read throws, having essentially the offense run through the scheme as opposed to the quarterback would be more beneficial to Kyler. That said, in that difficult environment, his completion percentage, his yards per attempt has gone up. His first read target share has gone down. He has done fairly well in a bad environment, in my opinion. That's not the narrative on him, though. The big problem, in my opinion, is time to scramble. It's at 5.6 seconds last year. Like, that is so long. 5.6 seconds is an eternity in the NFL to stand back there in the pocket. You couple that with a RPO rate of 2%, and it just says like they're asking Kyler to be more Drew Brees than Kyler Murray. And we're just not in that phase of his career. It took Drew Brees a long time to become Drew Brees. And so I think that the expectations, the scheme, the environment around him, the support structures are robbing Kyler Murray. I added it up to about 0.05 fantasy points per dropback, which is 30.6 points last year. That would have put him around 1.5 points per game higher, or QB8 overall seasonally. Like, that is where Kyler should be. The narrative does not assume that Kyler Murray is going to finish as QB8, given essentially the same situation, just using him the way that an NFL offense should be. And so this is, again, talent situation. What do you do with this? The nature, nurture, push, pull of the NFL. I think that there are much higher ceiling outcomes available to Kyler that you don't necessarily have to pay for today because of the Call of Duty narratives, because of the short boy narratives, because of the playbook language in his contract that got rescinded. Like, the vibes are just bad around this asset. And I think that there's like a pretty decent buy window. He's what, 27, 28 years old? I'm okay with that over the next 2 or 3 years. I think there's going to be a ceiling outcome that is going to create a much better sell window than there is today.
Yeah, I think that's pretty valid. Going back to your initial point about his rookie year, though, we've heard a very similar correlation or even storyline being said about Jayden Daniels, who is working with the same exact offensive coordinator as Kyler Murray was working with as a rookie with his head coach in Cliff Kingsbury. Do we foresee that the way in which Cliff is setting Jayden up for success moving forward can potentially have long-lasting impact to his own development, where he is primarily, a first read quarterback that doesn't have the flexibility to maneuver through a far more complex offensive scheme moving forward?
Yeah, and bring in a gadget player like Debo. I don't mean that in a negative way, but that's what he is. He's somewhere between a running back, a tight end, a wide receiver. He's a gadget player. You have to scheme up plays for Debo Samuel. That's not something you want to have for a developing passer. That's such a horrible move, in my opinion, for the long-term development of Jayden Daniels. And so I have concerns, not just from a valuation standpoint, but a production standpoint. Having to shoehorn in touches to players does not create better flow in an offense, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. And the only reason I even thought about Jayden Daniels, aside from the storyline, was that Jordan had dropped a trade that he had done with Kyler, a 26 and 27 first for Daniels, or vice versa. And I do think that that is a great way to move out of Jayden Daniels, honestly, in this specific window. Like, I think that that is something that I would personally do, knowing that there is, in my opinion, going to be probably some form of regression in year two. Now, could I be wrong? 100%. That's why player takes exist, and that's why I don't like giving them. But
It speaks to the quarterback landscape as a whole, though, as well, because I've had conversations with folks, Heath Cummings the other day, where we were talking about Josh Allen, 28, 29, 30-year-old quarterbacks. Those are not rebuilding targets. Those are get out targets right now if you want to capitalize on the value. We have, in theory, good quarterbacks coming over the next 2 years from college into the NFL. There's going to be an appetite for younger quarterbacks. And so splitting Daniels into essentially 3 quarterbacks potentially, that's going to really help you work through the market, I think, in better ways. And if you think there's going to be some regression for Daniels, Kyler could certainly overcome a lot of the lineup challenges you may have. You might give up, 2 or 3 points per game. You can fix that in all sorts of different ways, and split that asset, which I have concerns about. He's a small, slight guy. I don't love having those quarterbacks if I can get away from them, Josh Allen he's like a bull. I really like having those types of players because they turn into, I don't know, Ben Roethlisberger. They turn into Phillip Rivers. They don't turn into, RG3s, those types of players that are slight and rely on that. Like, Kyler Murray is a thick boy. If you look at pictures of him, like, he looks kind of like Maurice Jones-Drew did when he was playing, doesn't he?
yes. Like, the dude just has those genes, right? Like, you're just like, wow, that is a amazing smaller build that can just handle weight really well. But funny enough, like, his weight typically in his lower half really helps him more with balance than it does with like shedding tackles or anything along those lines. I do think that like his general weight is probably still a little too light for like handling a linebacker or a safety hit along the sidelines. But yeah, I think he does definitely have something more or less of a MJD build than I think a lot of people are willing to admit.
Yeah. Jay says Kyler moves like a kid running away with something he isn't supposed to have. I was chasing my toddler today. I was like, oh, that's Kyler Murray. We found him. And then we got Tony over here.
I love that.
Just an assassin here. running bugs the shit out of him. He just looks goofy, all stiff arm like a T-1000 in Terminator 2. That's good
I
stuff,
see it.
Tony. All right, let's see. Let's move on. We're running a little bit long here. I promised I'd get you out pretty much now, but we've got one more player, maybe two. Mark Andrews. He's a difficult player to assess right now, isn't he, Jake? Like, not because he isn't good at football, but because of the environment around Mark Andrews. Let's get into the numbers, and then I'm going to get your take on this before offering my own. 60% route participation last year. That's like 10 to 20% lower than he has been historically in his career. He's averaging around 4.1 targets last year. He was at 6 to 8. His yards per route run are still over 2, which is extremely good at tight end, in the elite category. His yard per route run, his yards after contact are the same as it really has been his entire career. His team touchdown rate was also great. He had 11 last year, but what's crazy is his team touchdown rate was the lowest of his career. His first free target share went way down though, 16%. First downs per route run, 0.119. Again, like really, really fantastic efficiency metric. Tell me about Mark Andrews. What are you doing with this guy?
I do think that Mark Andrews is a buy. I feel like I haven't really gone very strongly in my verbiage around most of the players so far today. And I do think that Mark Andrews sits there where I can confidently say, I do believe in Mark Andrews. Mark Andrews is very much in one of those precarious situations where I think health detrimented a good portion of what happened to Mark Andrews in 2024. So a lot of people don't talk about it for some reason, but he did come off of tightrope surgery. We know that from every player that has unfortunately gone through tightrope surgery, it takes somewhere between 9 to 12 months for them to come back to quote unquote 100% health, which has a lot to do with the actual performance of running. Like the actual physical form of running changes entirely from their tightrope surgery. With that being said, if you look at just the final 7 weeks of the season, we're talking about, 8. Mark ended up finishing with 7 touchdowns in the final 8 games of the year. His target increase shot up drastically from the first 9 weeks of the year. And we are seeing a player who is just significantly more involved in the offense than they were at the beginning. I think very similar to what we were talking about with Michael Pittman, Mark Andrews has almost like a stigma in the best way possible, a positive connotation to that offense where he is basically Lamar's blanket. And the defense needs him to be on the field. So I think even though Mark wasn't necessarily healthy to start the season, he was used as almost a blocking drone for individuals to interact with, thinking that he could be open for a dump off pass, but he wasn't actually going to be running those routes the same way he was towards the end of the season. I think a lot of people also live with those 2 major drops in the AFC. What was that? Divisional game, I want to say. Yes. Against the Buffalo Bills, where he had those 2 major drops. And those types of things play in people's minds to then start drawing up narratives around folks like Isaiah Likely. Now, that doesn't mean that Isaiah Likely's role can't necessarily grow in 2025. I just don't necessarily see a place where Mark Andrews doesn't have the same red zone success as he always has historically in his career. But to your point and in your write-up, like needing him to get closer to that 6 to 8 target range per game might be a challenge. Like if the Baltimore Ravens are as successful and efficient on the ground as they have been over the last few years, and the more targets or more people that are on the fields that will be potentially taking targets away from Mark Andrews, it will be challenging to get there. So then that means that he has to be even more efficient in other portions of the field. I'm still going to take that bet, given the cost is now at a place where I think is very, very, I think, palatable for me to get into Mark Andrews, even if he doesn't quote unquote hit. And we're talking about touching like early to mid second in a lot of league formats at only like 0.5 tight end premium.
Yeah. So in the regular season, Mark Andrews didn't have his first end zone drop until like week 16 or 17. He was perfect on the end zone targets, which led to that crazy touchdown run. He's as reliable as it gets in the red zone, in the end zone. I have no drop concerns, and that narrative has always kind of bothered me this non-point scoring season, because if you look at tight ends, like, he is among the best when the ball is thrown his way, not at separating, but of winning those contested catches. George Pickens wishes he was Mark Andrews. Like, that's how good he is at contested catches. I have no concerns there. And so it really just comes down to, like, what do you think the route participation is going to be? I don't think it's going to get worse than it was last year. I think that was the floor outcome. And we're paying floor prices right now. He's going essentially next to Travis Kelce in redraft rankings. If you think that Travis Kelce is washed, I think that Mark Andrews is probably 2 years away from that. So we've still got a little bit more runway, in my opinion. And if your expectation is last year, where did he finish? Do you know, in like a pretty typical format?
Typical format, looking at tight end 6 in
Six.
half PPR. I mean, half tight end premium.
Yeah, I think that is probably an expectation with a ceiling outcome of what, 3? I think that would be a ceiling outcome for Mark Andrews, and it's not an unreasonable ceiling outcome. And so at the prices that I'm seeing, I paid a 212 for Mark Andrews. This was a non-premium format, but that fills my tight end position for the next 2 years pretty comfortably, and then I'll just get TJ Hawkinson 2 years from now when he's, aging into that same range. And so I think that, yeah, like Jay is saying here, is he a buy now, sell later? Because Jay brings up a great point. Mark Andrews probably isn't going to be a Baltimore Raven in 2026, or it's probably at best a 50-50 bet that Mark Andrews is a Baltimore Raven next year. Do you have any concerns if Mark Andrews moves on into a different system, a different scheme, for that volume to go down further than 60% route participation?
No. Personally, no, I don't.
I don't either. And I think that it's possible that he ends up in a much better situation, right? Some situation where, we want to run through the tight end. What would happen if Aronde Gadsden isn't him and Mark Andrews becomes an LA Charger? I think that would be awesome. Or a LA Ram. Like, there are plenty of situations where there are more fruitful opportunities available, where maybe he becomes less of a blocker as he gets older. Like, that tends to be the path, not to become more of a blocker, but to become less of one and to have more designed routes. And so at current cost, I think Mark Andrews is probably the buy at tight end. Everyone's focusing on Bowers, on McBride, on Kittle. Is there a chance that Mark Andrews outscores Kittle next year? I think it's not likely, but I think it's possible.
Yeah, I don't like to talk in absolute, so I just don't see why someone would completely rule that opportunity out.
Yeah. Man, I kept you for a little over an hour. I think this is a great place to call it. Thank you so much to the Super Friends for the players, for proposing them, for getting those gears turning. It was a fun exercise for me to dig in and actually try to have a position on these players, to use a numbers-based approach, but to also know where we're making our bets. And I want to thank you, Jake, for doing the same thing on very short notice.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you to the Super Friends as well for challenging me in an exercise that I don't partake in regularly. Like, I think just even seeing how you go through it, Tommy, was incredibly beneficial for myself, just to kind of better understand and contextualize some of the relationships between past performance versus what I expect of players up in the upcoming year. And maybe not resting on the laurels of other people's work as much as I have done in my historic past. I think from like a legacy perspective, I didn't want to put forth that effort. And something that a co-host of mine says on Dynasty Underdog, everything about this game is about effort. So, like, I really do think that I need to put in more attention into the details of like why I'm buying into certain players and certain profiles, just outside of where the value might lie, because there's other places to get in and get out of them. So thank you for that. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, and if this is valuable to the super friends, let us know. We'll do more stuff like this, right? I'll make sure to get Jake on again at some point. You've been an awesome guest, and we'll involve others in the conversation as well, because y'all are really thoughtful listeners, really intelligent folks, and this helps me. I hope it helps you. If not, we'll scrap these and whatever. But I enjoy them, especially this time of year. So happy solstice to y'all. Hope you have a good weekend, and we'll talk soon. All right, bye guys. That was